Welcome back. In our last session, we discussed the aftermath of the Council of Jerusalem and the apostolic letter that Paul and Barnabas, along with Silas and Justus, were to bring to the churches, especially Antioch. This led naturally to the second missionary journey, which began with the split between Paul and Barnabas over John Mark. Paul then, with Silas, embarks on the journey, beginning with a visit to the churches founded on the first journey in Asia Minor. Then, one night in his sleep, Paul has the vision of a Macedonian gentleman who invites him to come to Europe and preach, which he does. That leads to the founding of the community in Philippi, which begins with the conversion of Lydia of Thyatira and her household. This leads to the narrative of the exorcism of a slave girl, which causes Paul and Silas to be haled before the magistrates of Philippi and ultimately flogged and jailed. In our current session, we'll begin with the miraculous events on the night that they are jailed, leading to the conversion of the jailer and his family. Then, the next day, we will talk about Paul and Silas's release. From Philippi, they journey to Thessaloniki, where they preach only to be run out of town. Then they move to Berea and ultimately to Athens, where we see Paul address the learned Athenians at the Areopagus. With the introductory phrase, about midnight, we surmise that something miraculous is about to happen. Luke tells us that Paul and Silas are praying. The missioners, as would anyone else in crisis, turn to prayer. The rest of the prisoners are listening to them, when suddenly there is a divine intervention in the form of an earthquake. The foundations of the prison were shaken, the doors were thrown open, and the chains binding all the prisoners were loosened. The commotion woke the jailer, who saw the prison door opened, presumed that the prisoners had escaped, and drew his sword to kill himself, feeling that he was disgraced, as Kurtz puts it, and would probably be imprisoned himself or even worse. Paul was quick to intervene, commanding the jailer not to harm himself. "We are all here," Paul says. The jailer calls that torches be brought. He enters where the prisoners were and verifies Paul's statement. And then Luke tells us, with trembling and with fear, he fell at the feet of Paul and Silas. Again, Kurtz notes, trembling and fear is the typical human reaction to a theophany, a manifestation of the presence and the power of God. Clearly, this jailer recognizes that he is in the presence of a power beyond himself. This makes him forget any thought of what might happen to him, but rather he asks the key question. What must I do to be saved? Paul simply responds, believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved. Note the connection between salvation and belief. This was a key point of Peter's speech at the Council of Jerusalem. Now it plays a significant role in the ministry of Paul. But not only the jailer, but his whole household as well. This recalls the account of Cornelius's conversion and Lydia of Thyatira's conversion. This question of the jailer allows Paul and Silas to evangelize. They spoke the word of the Lord to the jailer and to all who were in his house. Then the jailer takes them binds their wounds, and on the same night with his whole family, the jailer was baptized. Finally, they celebrate with a meal. Food is set before them, and there is great joy among them because they had believed in God. The Greek verb agaliao has the sense of exult or rejoice. In particular, it's used to describe a religious response to God's visitation or action. The reason for this joy is then expressed grammatically through a perfect participle of the verb believe. That is, they rejoice now because of the previous intervention of God and Paul's opening the Word of God to them that has brought them now into a state of belief. The scene switches now to the next morning. The magistrates send the raducus, saying, "Let these men go." Now this word rabducus is peculiar. It derives from the Greek rhabdoi, or wooden rods. Thus it could refer to the one who had flogged Paul and Silas the day before with wooden rods. Johnson notes, however, that they are lower in rank than the magistrates, the strategoi, yet above the jailer, the desmophulax. So he and many others translate the word simply as police. Excuse the digression on Greek, but this is one of the words that is used only in this narrative in the entire New Testament, and as such deserves some explanation. Seemingly after the events of the preceding night, the jailer returned Paul and Silas to their cell, because when the police inform the jailer that Paul and Silas are free, he brings the word to them. The magistrates have sent to let you go. Therefore, come out now and go in peace. But Paul demands that the indignity that they had undergone the previous day must be righted. Their honor had been damaged. They had beaten us publicly uncondemned. The word Paul uses, uncondemned, literally means without a trial. But more significantly, we are men who are Roman citizens, cives Romani. Being born in the Roman province of Cilicia, Paul, of a Roman father, Paul has Roman citizenship, which carries with it certain significant rights. Cicero had said, to bind a Roman citizen is a crime, to flog him an abomination, to slay him almost an act of fratricide, and against Verres. Finally, they threw us into prison, and now they want to release us secretly? Certainly not. Here, Paul is very emphatic. Paul will have none of this secretiveness. Let them come themselves and lead us out, he says. The magistrates need to be as public in their release of Paul and Silas as they were in imprisoning them. That would restore the honor disgraced by the magistrates. So the police, the rabducus, go and report Paul's words to the magistrates. The fact that they had flogged and imprisoned Roman citizens instilled fear in those magistrates. And as a result, the magistrates do come to Paul and Silas and apologize for their actions on the previous day. Various Bibles translate this word various ways. Apologize as here, placate in the New American, or urged in the New Jerusalem. Then they publicly lead them out of the prison and request that they leave Philippi. Paul's request had been answered. So, Paul and Silas left the prison as free men. And they did leave Philippi, but not before they stopped at the house of their convert, Lydia. They wanted to assure their converts that they were fine, to strengthen them, console them, and encourage them. Then they left Philippi. We'll end our discussion of Paul and Silas's visit to Philippi with some pictures of the amphitheater in Philippi where conceivably Paul and Silas were flogged. First, there's the general view as one approaches the stage area. Then, a view of the stage. And finally, a view of the seating arrangements. This is a theater that is not kept in as good a repair as some of the others, for example, Aspendos or Caesarea. Just to recap where we've been on this second journey, this leg began in Troas with the vision of Paul leading him to cross to Europe, landing at the port of Neapolis. From there, his party traveled to Philippi, where he baptized Lydia, encountered the slave girl, and was imprisoned. Now, following the blue line marking the path of his journey, they will move through Amphipolis and Apollonia to Thessalonica, modern-day Thessaloniki, and onward to Berea, modern-day Veria. The road that they travel is the Via Egnatia, a major east-west road in the Roman Empire traversing the distance from Byzantium, that is Constantinople, to the Adriatic Sea. Their journey takes them, as we saw on the map, through Amphipolis and Apollonia, ultimately arriving in Thessaloniki, the capital of the province of Macedonia. There they, as has been their custom, entered the synagogue of the Jews in that city. Today, one of the main churches of Thessaloniki is the Church of St. Demetrius, dedicated to the patron saint of Thessaloniki, who was a martyr of the early 4th century. Here, we have a picture of the mosaic of St. Demetrius near the sanctuary of the church, and this is the sarcophagus or the casket containing the mortal remains of St. Demetrius under another mosaic of the saint. To get a further feel of the city today, we have a few more pictures. Here, we have a view toward the sea from the upper city, and another from the same spot at a different angle. This is the White Tower of Thessaloniki, which was a watchtower to guard the city during the 15th century. It was thought to have been built by the Venetians, to whom the Byzantines had ceded the city in 1423. But later historical investigation has shown that it was actually built by the Ottomans as a protection for the city after the Sultan Murad II captured the city in 1430. Finally, one of my favorites, the Holiday Inn of modern Thessaloniki. There's something unusual about talking about a Holiday Inn in a city to which St. Paul addressed letters. Well, let's return to Thessalonica of St. Paul's day and his evangelization of its citizens. Luke is careful to reiterate that it was the regular practice of St. Paul to first enter the synagogue wherever he went. This manifests his fundamental commitment to evangelization of his own people. Thus, for 3 consecutive Sabbaths, Paul preaches, teaches, and reasons with the Thessalonian Jews on the basis of the Scriptures. The Greek word used for reason here is dialegomai, which has the overtone of a philosophical discussion. We get the English word dialectic from the same verb. What is more than likely happening then is a philosophical discussion on the basis of the Torah, which would then be held in common by Paul and the Jews of Thessalonica. The content of this reasoning and proof is then given. It's introduced by the word explain. The Greek word used for explain there is actually from a root meaning to open. So Paul actually opened the scriptures for the Thessalonians with the hope that the Spirit would open their minds and their hearts to hear. Put simply, the message was, it was necessary that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. Thus, Paul identifies that the Messiah he was talking about is Jesus, whom he's proclaiming. The result of his preaching is that some of them were persuaded. Note that the use of the passive voice implies that the persuasion is an action of God. Literally, it says, they cast their lot in favor of Paul. But not only Jews, devout Greeks, that is, those God-fearing men, and more than a few women who might be wives of the leaders, cast their lot in the favor of Paul also. So all in all, Paul's initial proclamation in Thessalonica was quite successful. But, as had occurred during the first journey and in Philippi, there were Jews who were not pleased with the preaching of Paul. So here, zealous Jews recruit wicked men, common rabble, who were simply hanging around the marketplace to form a mob and cause tumult or uproar in the city against Paul. This angry mob heads to the house of Jason, where the missionary band was staying, seeking to bring them out into the crowd to be tried and judged. The house of Jason was presumably a house church, much like the house church of Lydia in Philippi. But they were not able to find Paul or Silas at the house of Jason. But that was not going to stop this crowd. They abducted Jason and some of the other brethren at his house and haled them before the city authorities. The charge was, these people, that is Paul and Silas, have been subverting the empire. Now they're here in Thessalonica, and by housing them, Jason and his companions have been complicit in their action. They, in essence, have been proclaiming another king besides Caesar, thus acting against the decrees of Caesar and the empire. Johnson notes that the Greek noun basileus, which is translated here as king, its proper translation, ought to be translated as emperor, since that's the title that belonged to Caesar. More than likely, the translation king harkens back to the general theme in Luke Acts of Jesus as king. These charges trouble the people and the authorities, who nevertheless remain calm, not overacting as in other towns where Paul preached. They took security money, that is bail, for the accused, Jason and the rest, and then released them in full view of all the local Jews. The Greek for bail is interesting. It's literally translated as to take what is sufficient or what is necessary. But Kurtz notes that this is a guarantee against future trouble. If the Christians cause any more trouble, they will forfeit this bail money. Now, not wishing any more trouble, the brothers in Thessaloniki send Paul and Silas away to Berea by night. Upon arrival, they go to the Jewish synagogue, as they had in Damascus, Antioch, Pisidia, and Lystra. Berea is about 40 to 45 miles west of Thessaloniki. It was one of the most populous Macedonian cities at the time of Christ. Now, to give a sense of Berea, again, we have some pictures of the city as it exists today, the city of Veria. First off, the name is not Berea today. As I said, it is Varia. There is little in the city today to recall Paul and Silas's visit, save an outdoor shrine pictured here, next to a school. As one enters the shrine, the name is emblazoned in stone, Hieron Bema, the Holy Bema or the Holy Rostrum. The shrine itself has 3 mosaics. In the center is a mosaic of Paul over 3 steps. These 3 steps are thought to be the remains of the Bema, where Paul actually preached. To the left is a mosaic of Paul preaching to the people of Berea, seen here. And to the right is the mosaic of the Macedonian man inviting Paul to come to Europe, which we saw in the last session. Now, the people in Berea are described as more refined, more noble, more well-born, eugenesteros, than the people at Thessalonica. As a result, they received the word with eager enthusiasm. They listened and then examined the scriptures to verify what Paul and Silas were saying. In addition, their examination of the scriptures led many of them to become believers, some women of high standing and not a few men. All went well until word of Paul's success reached Thessaloniki, signified by our conjunction de. The Thessalonians came to Berea to agitate and stir up the people. This was similar to his experience in the first missionary journey in Antioch and Pisidia and Iconium. The brothers, as a result, whisk Paul off to the sea. Silas and Timothy remain in Berea, presumably to encourage and strengthen the new believers. The party with Paul traveled as far as Athens, where he sends word to Silas and Timothy to join him as soon as possible. Once again, we take a look at the map. Toward the very top left, we see Berea. From Berea on the sea, the red line drops down the coast of Greece, ultimately arriving at Athens. That's Paul's escape journey. Paul now enters one of the intellectual and political capitals of the ancient world, Athens, a city with a long and glorious history behind it. Granted, in the 1st century AD, Athens was not what it was in the 5th century BC, but it still remained an intellectual and religious center with monuments, statues, and temples to various gods everywhere. How will Paul evangelize in this situation? Again, we introduce Athens with a few pictures of how it looks today. Here is a picture of the Acropolis, on top of which is the temple known as the Parthenon. Next is the area as you approach the Parthenon known as the Propylaea. From Greek, it's the hall before, the doorway, pule. Once you pass through the Propylaea, the Parthenon stands square in front of you. One of the smaller buildings on the Acropolis is the Erechtheum, which is a temple dedicated to both Athena, Poseidon, and Erechtheus, the legendary king of Athens. The most famous aspect of it is its south portico, known as the Porch of the Maidens, in which 6 draped female figures are seen as supporting columns of the building. Finally, as one descends the Acropolis, we have the Odeon of Herodes Atticus. It was built in 161 AD by Herodes Atticus, an Athenian magnate. A renovation was completed in 1950, making it yet another theater of the ancient world that's still operative today. So Paul, having time to himself before the arrival of Silas and Timothy, wandered the city and was provoked, some would say even irritated or exasperated, by the fact that the city was filled with idols. And so all the more he saw the need for evangelization. He entered into discourse, debate, philosophical discussion with the Jews of Athens in their synagogue, along with the God-fearers. And as he had in every place else he visited previously, he spoke in the agora, or the city square, or the marketplace, to any who happened to be there and were willing to listen to him. In those discussions, Paul invariably would have encountered representatives of the great schools of philosophy of the day, the Epicureans and the Stoics. The Epicureans were followers of Epicurus, and they were somewhat impious and rejected religion on the basis of the theories of Democritus. The Stoics, on the other hand, were founded by Zeno. They were by far the most pious of the groups, holding in high place the notions of providence and divine immanence. These philosophers seem to mock Paul's discourse. What does this babbler mean? The word used to describe Paul here, spermatologos, literally means seed, sperma, collector, lego, a collector of seeds. Hence, it could be a seed picker, one who has picked up scraps of knowledge but no thorough knowledge of anything. Carrying the same meaning, it's been translated as a word scavenger. Now, others claimed that he seemed to be a preacher of foreign deities. That was one of the things that did Socrates in. They surmised this because Paul preached and announced the good news of one Jesus, and he preached about the resurrection, which, as we shall see, is a concept foreign to the Greek philosophers. Consequently, the philosophers in the marketplace brought Paul to the Areopagus. They brought him to the hill Pagos of Ares, or Mars, Ario, where the governing council of ancient Athens met. There, he's pressed to explain this new teaching that he was presenting. Seemingly, they're demonstrating a desire to learn what Paul says, but not investigate it. Kurtz comments that their question underlies how foreign the biblical message is to the pagan worldview. Now, to get a feel for the Areopagus, we again have a few pictures. This is the sign at the entrance to the Areopagus, which is the current text of Acts 18 in Greek. Then we see the steps leading up to the Areopagus as they exist today. They're somewhat narrow, very steep, and quite slippery when wet. Take my word for it. I tried coming down them in a rainy day. This is a view of the rocky crags of the Areopagus as it exists today from a point above. On the Areopagus, it's customary to read and to explain Acts 17, narrating St. Paul's experience there. Father Peter here, one of the seminary professors, is doing exactly that. Finally, from the Areopagus, we have a picture of the Agora, or the marketplace, where Paul did his initial preaching that led him to be brought to the Areopagus in the first place. The questioners continue with the reason for their query. Paul brings new things to their ears, that is, to their attention. The Greek root xenos literally means strange or foreign. Thus, what Paul is saying is foreign or strange to them, confirming what we said above, that they wish to learn new, strange, or foreign things. Then Luke presents his own summation of the matter. The Athenians and the foreigners, note the use of the root xenoi, xenos again, spent their time finding, hearing, or telling something new. They seek, if you will, intellectual fads, the latest novelties. So echoing Kurtz, Molina comments, it's clear that Paul is not on trial. Luke highlights that. Rather, the Athenian intellectual curiosity about his novelty is what they're interested in. So Paul stands in the midst of the assembly gathered in the Areopagus and delivers one of the most significant and well-crafted speeches of his career. Beginning in a typical manner, men of Athens, his first words drawn from his experience of Athens, which we know was somewhat repulsive with the idols and the gods, yet he takes that and turns it into a commendation of the Athenians. I perceive that you are in every way religious. Desidaimonisiros. The word that expresses this is desidaimon, that is fearing, dido, gods, daimon, in the comparative, thus more fearing of God than most. So, in a positive form, it can mean more religious, that is more God-fearing than all. Or negatively, it might betray Paul's real sense. You're more superstitious than all. Thus, Paul may mean one thing while his audience hears something quite different. Paul then gives the reason for his observation. As I passed along, or observed the objects of your worship, all the idols, I found an altar also with this inscription, to an unknown God. Thus, Paul continues to use his experience in Athens to draw in the audience. In fact, he will now let them know who their unknown God was. It's so important, let's look at that inscription in Greek. It's composed of two words, the first of which is composed of two parts, an a at the beginning, which means not, and nosto, from nostos, meaning known. And the second word is theo, from theos, meaning God. And so it translates to the unknown God. He continues, the one, therefore, you worship as unknown, this one I proclaim to you. In other words, you may call him unknown, but let me introduce him to you and you to him. Paul now has his opening to evangelize. Note how he uses the circumstances he finds himself in to move to evangelization. Next, Paul gives the identity of this unknown God. This is the God who made heaven and earth, and all that is in it. Thus, Paul makes his first point. God is creator. and as such has no need to dwell in temples made by humans or human hands. This parallels Stephen's speech that we saw earlier. Further, this God has no need of being served by human hands, as though he needed anything, that is, to be requesting return for his benevolence. He acts out of no ulterior motives. His actions are free acts of love and generosity. Rather, he gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. It is this God that has made the whole human race, that is, every nation of humans, from one human being. This is a direct allusion to the Genesis creation narrative. Then the emphasis switches to the notion of order, Paul's second major point. This God set apart and designated seasons and territories for their dwelling place. Again, we have a reference to Genesis, that is, the separation of land and the separation of time. All this separation and ordering took place that humanity might seek God and eventually feel their way toward God and find God. The Greek verb selaphao is quite interesting. It has the sense of grope, feel, or touch, almost like a person who was blind or who was trying to navigate in darkness. The darkness here is the lack of the revelation of the true God. It is that natural revelation born by philosophy that is leading this audience. Paul comes to bring the supernatural revelation that will light their way to God. In reality, this God is not far from any of us. Then Paul uses another hook to grab his audience. He cites their own authors in support of what he's saying. In him we live and move and have our being. This is a possible citation of the poet Epimenides, a sage of Greece. In other words, we are, even though we may not recognize it, dependent on this God. And then, making the citation explicit, even some of your own poets have said. Note, Paul is citing Greek poets in the same way he cited the Torah. Now the citation. We are indeed his offspring. We are also of his family. From the phenomena of the poet Aratus. In their original form, both of these verses were directed to the Greek god Zeus. But Paul has redirected them to the one true God, Adonai, in this speech. Building on the notion of kinship, genos, Paul sees us as an offspring of God through the fact that God has created humanity in his own image. We are indeed the family of God. But that does not mean a God who is silver, or a God who is gold, or a God who is stone, shaped by that art and imagination of man. Such impression of the craft and thought of humans is idolatry. This God is no idol. Paul impresses that upon the Athenians. He then moves to his third point, that this God is a God who will judge. This notion forms the concluding exhortation of the speech. This God overlooks the times of ignorance, that is, when they did not know him. This is like God's overlooking the failure of God's own people, the Jews, to believe in Jesus. Now, this same God overlooks the idolatrous idea of the divine that the Gentiles have. But rather, this God commands peoples everywhere, Jew and Gentile, to repent, to change their hearts. The reason for this repentance is that God has established a day when he will judge the world with justice. This is a hearkening back to the Old Testament notion of the day of judgment or the day of the Lord, found in the prophets, and such places as Psalm 9:8, Psalm 66:4, and Psalm 95:13. This judgment will take place at the hands of a man, a male, an heir, whom he has appointed. The Greek verb horizo has the sense of declaring bounds for. The bounds seemingly are the limits of humanity. This human whom God has appointed is both fully divine, God, and fully human, man. And as such, he is understanding of our limits, our trials, and our difficulties. The proof of this is that God has raised this man from the dead. It's here, in this last line, that Paul gets himself into trouble. The notion of resurrection is not a common notion in Greek philosophy. Their understanding of afterlife is more along the lines of immortality, particularly immortality of the soul. As a result, they began to mock, to laugh, to sneer, to scoff at this notion of resurrection in a rather dismissive manner. These more than likely were the Epicureans, but there were some who were interested. We will hear you on that, they say, at another time. But they are not eager to set a date for this discussion. It's the ancient equivalent, more than likely, of don't call us, we'll call you. And so Paul went out from their midst again. Note that Paul is free to depart from this group, yet there is no resolution. This argues for the preceding having been a casual inquiry rather than any form of legal proceeding. But all was not lost. Some did believe, and some joined up with Paul. Two of these who were converted are named. Dionysius the Areopagite, who was a member of the council of the Areopagus and thus a man of high social rank. The church historian Eusebius tells us that the same Dionysius became the first bishop of the Church of Athens, and so to this day is considered the patron saint of Athens. The other was a woman named Damaris, of whom little is known. Perhaps she is a prominent member of the church in Athens, somewhat akin to Lydia and Philippi. And there were others who will remain nameless. And so this seems to be a meeting of Jerusalem with Athens, of Jewish culture with Greek culture. And it did not go exactly that well. Paul's experience in Athens may provide clues for our evangelizing efforts today. First and foremost, Paul goes out to the people in the marketplace, in the public forum. He meets them where they are, rather than waiting for them to come to him. He's willing to bring up his faith and proclaim it, even in situations which were unfamiliar to the people he was addressing. He begins affirming the people he's evangelizing, and then speaks from common ground, in this case the altar to an unknown God, and citations from their poets. And despite few converts, he ceases to give up, but rather forges on to the next site, in this case Corinth. That's where we shall take up the story next time.